The silence in the small apartment was a physical weight, thick and suffocating. It was broken only by the rhythmic drip, drip, drip of the kitchen faucet, each drop a tiny hammer counting down the final hours. Liam, a carpenter whose hands were made for building things, now felt only the urge to break them. His gaze was fixed on the stark, red print of the eviction notice lying on the table. Final warning. 24 hours. He felt his heart tighten into a cold, hard knot. A familiar sensation he'd lived with for months. A bitter, metallic taste filled his mouth, the taste of failure. The air, once filled with the scent of his wife's lavender soap, now reeked of dust and poverty, a stale and defeated odor that clung to the worn-out furniture and his own unwashed clothes. He was 35, but a weariness deep in his bones made him feel ancient. From the living room floor, the faint, innocent humming of a nursery rhyme drifted towards him. Maya, his 7-year-old daughter, she was coloring, completely absorbed in creating a vibrant, sunny world on a scrap of paper with a crayon worn down to a nub. The sound, so pure and unaware, was like a knife twisting in Liam's gut. A wave of nausea rose hot and acidic in his throat. He was a protector who couldn't protect, a provider who couldn't provide. He looked at her, at the absolute trust in her eyes whenever she looked at him, and the shame was so intense it made it hard to breathe. The crushing weight of his failure was a physical presence, pressing down on his chest, stealing the very air from his lungs. He was failing her. He was failing the memory of his wife. His eyes flickered to the cheap laptop on the counter, the screen glowing with the brutal final number. 217 to 34, that was it. The sum total of a life's work, of dreams, of calloused hands and overtime shifts. All of it vaporized by a mountain of medical bills that hadn't even saved her. $217, that was the flimsy barrier standing between his child and the unforgiving cold of the streets. He could feel the dull, persistent ache of hunger in his own stomach, a gnawing hollowness he'd ignored for 2 days. But Maya had to eat. He opened the cupboard. The metallic clang of a single, final can of chicken soup echoed in the cavernous, empty space. It was the loneliest sound in the world. He heated the soup, his hands shaking as he poured the watery broth and its sad, pale vegetables into a bowl. The smell was thin and artificial, the scent of rock bottom. He watched Maya eat, her face a mask of concentration as she carefully spooned the soup into her mouth. Oblivious to the fact that it was their last meal in this home, their last moment of warmth and shelter. Every spoonful she took was a tick of the clock. Tomorrow, the familiar comfort of her small bed, the softness of the threadbare rug she now sat on, it would all be ripped away. A cold dread, as sharp and real as a shard of glass, pierced through him. The fear was no longer a distant worry. It was here, a cold shadow falling over his daughter. He had to do something, anything. But as his eyes darted from the eviction notice to his daughter's trusting face, to the pathetic, glowing number on his bank screen, a terrifying paralysis seized him. He was a ship taking on water, sinking into an abyss of his own making. A father with nothing left to give, a protector with nowhere left to go. The walls of the apartment felt like they were shrinking, the air growing thinner with every ragged breath. This was the bottom, a hole so deep and dark he couldn't see any light. How could any man climb out of this? Liam's desperate fight for survival is just beginning. If you want to follow his incredible story of struggle and discovery, make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss what happens next. With the eviction notice as his witness, Liam's fingers flew across the laptop's keyboard, the frantic clicking a desperate drumbeat against the apartment's oppressive silence. The search bar glowed in the dark room, a harsh white rectangle reflecting in his wide, terrified eyes. Affordable housing, emergency shelter, work for cash. Each search returned a list of dead ends, of waiting lists years long and shelters already overflowing. The bitter taste of failure was a constant presence in his mouth, a coppery tang of dread. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. He wasn't just looking for a place to sleep. He was searching for a miracle, a single thread of hope in a world that had become a tangled, impenetrable web of despair. He could feel the minutes draining away, each tick of the clock on the screen a step closer to the street, a step closer to failing Maya in the most fundamental way a father could. Every closed browser tab felt like a door slamming shut in his face. locking him out in the cold. Then he saw it. Buried deep within a classifieds website, under a section for scrap and salvage, was an ad that made his breath catch in his throat. The photo was grainy and poorly lit, showing the hulking silhouette of a vehicle against a bleak sky. The text was blunt, almost an afterthought. 1980s school bus, $200, as is. The words, as is, were a footnote his mind refused to process. All he could see was the price, $200, a number that was, by some cruel twist of fate, almost exactly what he had left. An insane, irrational flicker of hope ignited in the cold darkness of his chest. It wasn't a home, not a real one, but it was a roof. It was 4 walls of steel. It was a private space, a tiny kingdom they could call their own, safe from the rain and the judging eyes of strangers. He imagined painting it, fixing it up, creating a small, cozy haven for Maya. The idea, born of pure desperation, took root in his exhausted mind, blooming with a dangerous, vibrant color that momentarily eclipsed the bleakness of their reality. The decision was a lightning strike, swift and absolute. There was no time for doubt, no room for second-guessing. He glanced over at the floor where Maya slept, her small chest rising and falling in a peaceful, trusting rhythm. Her face, so serene in sleep, was a stark contrast to the storm raging inside him. He had to protect that peace. This bus, this rusted metal shell from a forgotten decade, became the vessel for all his remaining hope. It was a wild, desperate gamble, a bet made with the last pennies of his old life. With a trembling finger, he clicked the confirm purchase button. The sound of the confirmation email dinging in his inbox was deafening in the silent apartment. He checked his bank balance, $17.34. The number stared back at him, stark and final. A wave of nausea, a dizzying mix of pure terror and fragile, unhinged optimism washed over him. There was no going back. He had just thrown them off a cliff, praying this ridiculous yellow bus had wings. The next morning arrived with a harsh grey light that seemed to mock his sleepless night. The finality of their departure was a physical weight. Packing was a swift, brutal affair. There was little to take. A single battered suitcase held the remnants of their life, a few changes of clothes, Maya's favorite worn teddy bear, and a framed photo of his wife, her smile a painful, beautiful ghost. Liam's hands felt numb as he locked the apartment door for the last time. The metallic click of the deadbolt was a sound of absolute finality, the severing of their last tie to a normal life. He took Maya's small, warm hand in his, the simple trust in her grip a fresh stab of guilt. "Where are we going, Daddy?" she asked, her voice small and laced with a confusion that mirrored the chaos in his own heart. He forced a smile, the muscles in his face feeling stiff and alien. "We're going on an adventure," he said, the lie tasting like ash on his tongue as they walked away from the only home she had ever known. The journey was a slow, draining crawl away from everything familiar. A series of public buses carried them out of the city's sprawling concrete heart, the landscape gradually bleeding into forgotten rural roads and withered and brown fields. The steady, monotonous drone of the bus engines was a lulling hum that did nothing to quiet the screaming anxiety in Liam's mind. He stared out of the grimy window, watching the world blur past, feeling like a ghost drifting between worlds. He tried to keep up the pretense of an adventure for Maya, pointing out cows and old barns with a forced enthusiasm that felt hollow and pathetic even to his own ears. He felt the crushing weight of her innocent excitement, her belief in his lie. Each of her happy questions about their new bus house was a small torment, tightening the knot of dread in his stomach. He was piloting them directly into the unknown, fueled by nothing more than a desperate and likely foolish prayer. Their final stop was not a station, but a desolate crossroads in the middle of nowhere, marked by a single, creaking telephone pole. The air that greeted them as they stepped off the bus was cold, and smelled of damp earth and something vaguely metallic, like old blood. A rusted, bullet-pocked sign pointed down a long, unpaved track. Finch Salvage. The name sounded ominous. Final. The silence here was a different kind than in the city. It was an active, pressing void, broken only by the mournful whistle of wind rustling through dead, skeletal weeds that lined the road. A deep, primal sense of isolation began to creep into Liam's bones, a coldness that had nothing to do with the temperature. This wasn't just rural, it was forsaken. It felt like the edge of the map, a place where things were sent to be forgotten. He clutched Maya's hand tighter, a sudden fierce protectiveness surging through him. He already hated this place with every fiber of his being. The walk down the dirt track was a grueling ordeal. The recent rain had turned the road into a thicker, greedy mud that sucked at their worn-out shoes with a wet-y, sloppy sound, trying to pull them down. After a few minutes, Maya's small legs couldn't manage it anymore. Liam lifted her into his arms, her weight a familiar, comforting burden, though his own muscles screamed in protest from exhaustion and hunger. In the distance, the junkyard slowly materialized from the grey mist. It wasn't a yard. It was a mountain range of decay, a sprawling necropolis of rusted cars, twisted machinery, and shattered dreams, all piled high against a bruised, indifferent sky. The sheer scale of the ruin was staggering, a monument to obsolescence. The fragile image of a cozy, refurbished bus home began to crack and splinter in his mind, replaced by a growing sense of profound dread. This was not a place of new beginnings. This was a place where things came to end. As they reached the splintered gate, a man emerged from a small corrugated iron shack. He was gaunt, with a face like a clenched fist, and clothes stained with years of grease and grime. He held a clipboard like a weapon. Liam, his voice hoarse, explained he was here for the bus. The man grunted, barely making eye contact, his gaze sweeping over Liam and Maya with cold indifference. He jabbed a dirty thumb towards a far corner of the sprawling, muddy lot. Yellow bus. Back corner, keys in it. And with that, he turned and disappeared back into his shack, the door slamming shut with a bang of dismissal. There was no assistance, no hint of humanity. The cold, transactional nature of the encounter was a slap in the face. Liam felt his fragile hope, which had already been teetering on a knife's edge, begin to crumble into dust. He was alone, with his daughter, in a wasteland, and no one cared. The feeling of being utterly abandoned was a physical blow. The trek through the junkyard itself was a nightmare. They navigated a treacherous labyrinth of towering, unstable piles of scrap metal. The ground was a hazardous carpet of shattered glass, sharp, rusty edges, and deep, muddy puddles. Every few steps, the crunch of their feet on broken parts echoed unnervingly through the silent graveyard of machines. A cold wind moaned through the hollowed-out chassis of cars, creating a low, ghostly whistle that made the hairs on Liam's arms stand on end. The air was thick with the overpowering stench of rust, old oil, and the sour, stagnant smell of decay. Liam shielded Maya's face with his hand, trying to protect her from the jagged metal and the oppressive, sorrowful atmosphere of the place. It felt like they were trespassing through the skeletal remains of a forgotten world, and the journey to their supposed sanctuary was proving to be as punishing as the hell they had just escaped. Then, through a gap between a crushed pickup truck and a pile of washing machines, they saw it, the bus, and Liam's heart didn't just sink. It plummeted into a cold and dark abyss. The photograph in the ad had been a liar, a cruel artist of deception. This was not a vehicle, it was a carcass. The once bright school bus yellow was a diseased, peeling memory, a leprous skin of faded paint flaking away to reveal a body ravaged by angry orange rust. It was slumped forward on 4 completely flat and rotted tires, sinking into the mud as if the earth itself was slowly trying to reclaim it. Several windows were not just grimy but shattered, leaving jagged black mouths that gaped open to the elements. This wasn't a home. This wasn't a shelter. This was a metal coffin, abandoned and left to rot. The last spark of hope that had propelled Liam this far was extinguished in an instant, replaced by a cold, heavy dread that settled deep in his gut like a stone. He put Maya down, his hands shaking slightly, and approached the ruin. The main door, warped and swollen with rust, was jammed shut. He had to slam his shoulder against it once, twice, a third time with a pained grunt, before it finally gave way. It opened with a loud, prolonged shriek of tortured metal on metal, a sound that sliced through the junkyard silence like a scream of agony. As the door opened, a wave of foul air, thick and gag-inducing, washed over them. It was the putrid, layered scent of decades of neglect, the sharp, earthy smell of mildew, the cloying stench of rot, and the sour odor of stagnant, greasy water. Liam instinctively recoiled, grabbing Maya and pulling her back, his own stomach churning violently. A cold, hard realization began to set in. He had made a catastrophic mistake. He had led his daughter into the belly of this dead thing, and it was even more rotten on the inside. Stepping cautiously up the rusted steps was like entering a crypt. The inside was a scene of utter dereliction, far worse than he could have possibly imagined. Murky water had pooled on the buckled metal floor, reflecting the grey sky in slick, oily patches. The rows of vinyl seats were a disaster, slashed and torn, their yellowed foam padding spilling out like the viscera of some dead animal. In several places, the rust had eaten clean through the floor, creating gaping holes that revealed the dark, wet mud beneath their feet. Feeble light struggled to penetrate the grimy windows, illuminating a galaxy of dust motes dancing in the cold, still, tomb-like air. The profound silence within the bus was heavy and suffocating, the kind of silence that feels ancient and absolute. A wave of nausea rose in Liam's throat. This wasn't a fixer-upper, it was a grave, and he had just paid to be buried in it. The despair was a physical presence, cold and immense. The full, crushing weight of his monumental error slammed into Liam with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't a solution. This wasn't even a temporary fix. This was the end of the line. He had spent his last $200, the final barrier between his daughter and total destitution, on this useless, rotting hunk of scrap metal. He had dragged her away from the city, away from any potential help, to this cold, muddy, isolated hellscape. There was no food, no clean water, no electricity, and no way back. The flicker of hope he had so foolishly nurtured now felt like a cruel, vicious joke the universe had played on him. A profound, soul-crushing despair washed over him, so powerful it buckled his knees. He stumbled back against the cold, damp wall of the bus, the jagged rust biting into his jacket, and slid down to the filthy floor, his head in his hands. He was trapped, utterly and completely trapped. Seeing the strength finally drain from her father, Maya's composure broke. Her fear, held back for so long, finally surfaced in quiet, hiccuping sobs that tore through Liam's shattered soul. "It's cold, Daddy," she whispered, her small body trembling as she huddled against him. "I'm scared." Her words, so small and fragile in the vast rotting shell of the bus, were the final blow. The last dam of his composure, the one he had so desperately maintained for her, shattered into a million pieces. A bottomless, terrifying emptiness opened up inside him. He had not only failed to protect her, he had actively led her into greater danger, into a colder, more desolate corner of the world. The shame was a burning acid in his chest. He had gambled and lost not just his money, but their very last chance. This was a new bottom, a depth of failure colder and darker than he could have ever conceived. He was a father who had led his child to a tomb. He pulled Maya into a hug that felt useless and hollow, his arms offering no warmth, no real comfort. He buried his face in her hair, trying to block out the sight of their new prison. But the sensory assault was total. He could not escape the acrid smell of decay, the feeling of the freezing damp metal seeping through his thin jacket, or the sound of the wind whistling a desolate tune through the bus's broken windows. He had chased a phantom of hope, a desperate mirage in the desert of his poverty, and it had led them here, to this graveyard of metal. As he held his crying daughter in the heart of the wreck, he felt nothing but the vast, cold, silent expanse of a man who had finally and truly lost everything. There was no more fight left in him. There was no plan. There was only the cold, the rust, and the terrifying certainty that they had nowhere left to fall, after what felt like an eternity spent drowning in the cold abyss of his failure. A primal instinct flickered to life within Liam. It was the instinct of a father. He looked at Maya, her small frame shivering, her face pale in the gloomy half-light, and the suffocating despair gave way to a grim, steely resolve. This metal tomb would not be their grave. He would not let it. A cold fire ignited in his veins, burning away the paralysis. He had to make this place survivable, even for one night. His carpenter's mind, long dormant under the weight of grief and poverty, began to stir, assessing the ruin not as a failure, but as a problem to be solved. His heart still felt like a block of ice in his chest, but his hands, his capable hands, remembered their purpose. They needed warmth, and they needed a safe place to sleep. The task was monumental, almost absurd, but it was the only thing standing between him and utter surrender. The first order of business was to block the wind. He found a roll of duct tape in his worn-out tool bag, a relic from his past life. He began to patch the shattered windows using pieces of cardboard he ripped from the interior walls of the bus. The tearing sound of the cardboard was loud and jarring in the silence, a sound of desperate industry. The wind howled outside, a mournful, lonely sound that seemed to mock his efforts, but with each piece of cardboard he taped into place, the bone-chilling draft lessened. His fingers grew numb and clumsy from the cold, the silver tape sticking to his skin, but he worked with a focused, almost manic energy. He was no longer just a victim of circumstance. He was a man fighting back, even if his only weapon was a cheap roll of tape, and his only fortress was this rusted-out shell. It was a pathetic battle, but it was a battle nonetheless. He had to create a space for Maya, a small island of relative comfort in this sea of decay. He chose the pair of seats nearest the back, the ones least exposed to the gaping holes in the floor. They were still filthy and torn, but they were the best of a terrible lot. He used the last of their clean water and a rag from their suitcase to wipe down the grimy vinyl, the dirt coming away in thick black streaks. The smell of mildew was overpowering, a gag-inducing stench that filled his nostrils with every breath. He felt a wave of self-loathing wash over him. This was the bed he was making for his daughter, a ripped, mouldy seat in a derelict bus. The shame was a physical ache, a tightness in his throat, but he pushed it down. He had to keep moving, had to keep working, stopping to think. To truly feel the depth of their situation was a luxury he could not afford. The work was a shield against the crushing reality. Once the surface was as clean as he could get it, Liam focused on creating some semblance of a bed. He unzipped their single suitcase and pulled out every piece of clothing they owned, a few sweaters, some t-shirts, his spare pair of jeans. He laid them carefully over the vinyl, attempting to create a thin layer of padding, a barrier against the cold, unforgiving surface and the dampness that seemed to emanate from the very metal of the bus. The small pile of clothes looked pathetic and inadequate, a meager offering against the overwhelming squalor of their surroundings. He folded his own jacket, the only truly warm thing they had, to use as a pillow for her. A cold dread seeped into his bones as he looked at the makeshift bed. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. He watched as Maya, exhausted from the journey and the emotional turmoil, crawled onto the seat. She curled into a small ball, pulling a worn sweater over her legs. He tucked the threadbare blanket from their suitcase around her shoulders, the fabric feeling thin and useless. "Try to get some sleep, sweetie," he whispered, his voice sounding hollow and strange in the cavernous space. For a moment she was quiet, and Liam dared to hope she might drift off. The silence was heavy, filled only by the low whistle of the wind finding its way through the countless cracks in the bus's metal skin. He stood over her, a helpless guard in a fallen kingdom, his stomach twisting into a tight, painful knot of hunger and fear. He felt a desperate urge to protect her, an instinct so powerful it was a physical force, yet he was failing at every turn. Then Maya shifted, her small body wriggling uncomfortably. "Daddy," she mumbled, her voice muffled by the jacket pillow. "Something's poking me." Liam's first reaction was a flash of weary irritation. Of course something was poking her. The entire bus was a collection of sharp edges and broken parts. A spring must have broken through the old seat. "Just try to move over a little bit." "Honey," he said, his voice flatter than he intended. He was cold, he was hungry, and his reserves of patience were worn down to a nub. He just wanted this day to end. He wanted the darkness to swallow them up, and for the morning to somehow, magically be better. But his wish for a moment of peace was not to be. "No, Daddy, it's really hard," Maya insisted, pushing herself up. "It's right here." She pointed to a spot on the seat cushion, near the backrest. "It hurts." Her complaint, laced with the beginnings of a whine, cut through his exhaustion. He sighed, the sound a small white cloud in the frigid air, and knelt beside the seat. He ran his hand over the spot she had indicated. The vinyl was cold and brittle beneath his calloused fingers, but underneath it, deep within the decaying foam padding, he felt it. It wasn't a spring. A spring was wiry, sharp. This was different. It was a solid, dense lump. It was rectangular, unyielding. A cold spike of curiosity, the first emotion other than despair he'd felt in hours, shot through him. What was this? He pressed down on it, his brow furrowed in concentration. The object was about the size of a brick, but it felt lumpy, uneven. It didn't belong. He ran his fingers along the edge of the seat, tracing the seams of the upholstery. That's when he noticed the second strange detail, the seam on the underside of the seat, directly below where he felt the hard object, was different from all the others. The original stitching on the bus seats was a thin, mass-produced thread, now rotting and brittle in most places, but this section, about 2 feet long, was sewn shut with something else entirely. It was a thick, heavy-duty thread, almost like a thin cord, and the stitches were tight, crude, and incredibly strong. It was a repair, but it was more than that. It was a deliberate, forceful sealing. Someone had put something inside this seat and had gone to great lengths to make sure it stayed there. The sight of that thick, dark thread against the faded vinyl sent an involuntary shiver down his spine. This wasn't a factory mistake or a simple repair. This was a secret. His heart, which had been beating with a slow, despairing rhythm, began to pick up its pace. A sudden, sharp focus cut through the fog of his exhaustion. Who would take the time to sew up a school bus seat with such heavy-duty thread? And what were they so determined to hide inside it? The question hung in the cold, dead air of the bus, a silent, vibrating mystery. He pulled his utility knife from his tool bag. The familiar weight of it in his hand was a small comfort. He looked from the strange, thick seam to Maya's curious face, her earlier complaint forgotten as she watched him. A sense of trespass, of violating something he shouldn't, warred with an overpowering curiosity. For a moment, he hesitated, the blade hovering over the coarse thread. Then he thought of the $17 in his bank account, the gnawing hunger in his belly, and the freezing cold that was seeping into their bones. He had nothing left to lose. With a decisive movement, he pressed the sharp tip of the blade against a stitch and pushed. The tough thread resisted for a moment, then gave way with a small snap. The sound was unnervingly loud in the quiet bus. He worked carefully, methodically, slicing one stitch after another. The coarse thread was greasy to the touch, and it took considerable pressure to cut through it. With each severed stitch, his heart beat a little faster. He wasn't just cutting thread, he was opening a door that had been sealed for a very long time. A tangible sense of anticipation filled the small space, a silent, electric charge that pushed back against the oppressive gloom. He felt like an archaeologist on the verge of a discovery, peeling back the layers of time with the edge of his blade. Right here in this forgotten metal crypt. Finally, the last stitch was cut. He took a deep breath, the cold air burning his lungs, and pulled back the flap of torn vinyl. The yellowed foam padding beneath was crumbling and decayed, and it fell away in dusty, foul-smelling chunks as he peeled it back with his fingers. And there, nestled deep within the hollowed-out cavity of the seat, was a package. It was wrapped in a thick, dark, oily-looking fabric. It wasn't a random piece of junk. It was placed there deliberately, a dark rectangular shape hidden away from the world. Liam stared at it, his breath catching in his throat. It was real. There was truly something hidden here. A tremor ran through his hands, a mixture of cold fear and a wild, burgeoning hope that felt dangerously like the one that had led him here in the first place. But this was different. This wasn't a grainy photo in an online ad. This was solid. It was real. He could reach out and touch it. He slowly, hesitantly reached into the seat's guts and lifted the package out. It was heavier than he expected, dense and solid. The fabric it was wrapped in was old oilcloth, the kind used decades ago to waterproof things. It was slick and slightly sticky to the touch, and it smelled faintly of machine oil and dust, a scent of a long-gone era. The package was tightly bound with yellowed, brittle twine. He could feel the distinct rectangular shapes of its contents through the thick wrapping. His mind raced, a chaotic jumble of impossible possibilities. What could possibly be worth hiding so carefully in such a miserable place? He placed the package on the adjacent seat and worked at the knot in the twine with trembling fingers. The old cord was stubborn, but finally it broke apart in his hands, turning to dust. He carefully unfolded the stiff, cracked corners of the oilcloth. The last layer of fabric fell away, and Liam's mind went completely blank. He simply stared, unable to process what he was seeing. Stacks of money, old $100 bills, bound in faded paper bands. It wasn't a few bills. It was a thick, solid brick of cash. The face of Benjamin Franklin, stern and green, stared up at him from the top bill. A wave of dizziness washed over him, and he had to put a hand on the seat to steady himself. It couldn't be real. This was a dream, a hallucination brought on by hunger and despair. It had to be a cruel joke. His hand shook as he reached out and touched the top bill. It felt real. The paper was old and soft, but it had the distinct, unmistakable texture of currency. He lifted the top stack. It was heavy, solid. He fumbled with the paper band, tearing it open, and the bills fanned out in his lap. Hundreds, bill after bill after bill, a choked, incredulous sound. Something between a laugh and a sob escaped his lips. His mind, struggling to catch up, tried to calculate what he was holding. It was an impossible, life-altering amount of money. Was there more? The thought hit him like a jolt of electricity. If someone hid one package, why not more? A frantic, manic energy surged through him, eclipsing the cold and the hunger. He turned to the other seats, his eyes wild. He was no longer a desperate father trying to make a bed. He was a treasure hunter possessed. He moved to the next seat in the row, his hands working with feverish speed, tearing at the vinyl, digging his fingers into the decaying foam like a man digging for gold. And he found another one, another oilcloth-wrapped package, just as heavy, just as dense. A wild, unhinged laugh erupted from his chest, echoing strangely in the metal shell of the bus. He ripped this one open without care, the brittle oilcloth tearing away to reveal more stacks of hundreds. He scrambled to the next seat, and the next, a storm of yellow foam and ripped vinyl erupting around him. It was a frenzy of destruction and discovery. He found a third package, then a fourth. Each discovery fueled his delirium. He was pulling bricks of cash from the rotten guts of the bus, piling them on the floor in a heap of unimaginable wealth. The sheer unreality of the situation was staggering. One moment he was at the absolute bottom, with nothing, and the next he was surrounded by a fortune. He stopped his frantic search only when he reached the last passenger seat. It felt different, lighter. He tore it open with the same desperate energy and found a final or smaller package. He ripped open the oilcloth, expecting more cash, but found something else nestled within the last few stacks of bills. It was a small, black book, a pocket ledger with a worn, brittle leather cover. It felt cold and heavy in his hand, a stark contrast to the soft paper of the money. He opened it. The pages were filled with neat, tight columns of dates, names and numbers, written in a faded, spidery blue ink. A cold feeling, entirely different from the exhilaration of finding the money, began to creep up his spine. This wasn't just a hoard of cash. This was a record. The money was the what? This little black book, he knew with a sudden, chilling certainty, was the why. The mountain of cash on the floor was a surreal, impossible island in the middle of their sea of decay. For a moment, Liam was lost in the sheer, dizzying spectacle of it. $500,000. The number was so vast it was meaningless. It was salvation. It was a new house, a new business, a future for Maya, free from the gnawing hunger and the biting cold. A frantic, giddy joy swelled in his chest, so powerful it almost made him laugh. But as his eyes fell upon the small, black ledger still clutched in his hand, a cold countercurrent of dread began to pull him under. The money felt electric, buzzing with a strange energy, but the book felt heavy, dense with secrets. It was a cold, dead weight in his palm, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the joy of the discovery was over. The true cost of this treasure was written on these pages. He sat on the grimy floor, the musty smell of old money mixing with the stench of mildew, and slowly opened the ledger. The brittle, yellowed paper felt like it might disintegrate at his touch. He handled it with the reverence of a scholar examining a sacred text, though what he felt was not reverence, but a deep, gut-wrenching foreboding. Maya was still asleep, her breathing a soft, rhythmic whisper in the profound silence. He was grateful for her oblivion. He didn't want her to see the look he was sure was dawning on his face. The ink on the pages was a faded blue, the handwriting a series of tight, controlled loops and slashes. It was the handwriting of a man who was meticulous, organized, and utterly without soul. His heart began to hammer against his ribs, not with the thrill of a treasure hunter, but with the slow, heavy beat of a man walking towards a gallows. At first, the entries were a cryptic jumble of dates, abbreviations, and numbers. They were meaningless without a key, but then, as he turned a page, a heading caught his eye, written in the same neat, spidery script, Hydro Dam Project Payroll Ledger. Below it were columns of names: Garcia, Hernandez, Rojas, dozens of them. They were the invisible men who built the modern world, the ghosts who haunted construction sites. Next to each name was a number under a column labeled Wages Paid. The figures were insultingly low, barely enough to survive. A cold stone of unease settled in Liam's stomach. This wasn't a ledger of savings. It was an accounting of exploitation. The air inside the bus felt suddenly colder, heavier, as if the ghosts of these forgotten men were gathering in the darkness around him, their silent, accusing eyes fixed on the piles of their stolen hope. He found the entry that broke his heart. It was a single line, but it screamed with a universe of injustice. Name: J. Ramirez. Official pay: $300, paid $50. Skim: $250. Reason: no papers, no voice. The clinical, detached cruelty of the word stole the breath from his lungs. A wave of hot, furious sickness rose in his throat. This money, this miraculous fortune that had promised him a new life, was not a miracle at all. It was a monument to theft, built from the stolen wages of men who had been too powerless, too scared to fight back. He looked at the stacks of $100 bills, and he no longer saw salvation. He saw the food taken from the mouths of children, the medicine never bought, the dreams that had withered and died in the harsh Texas sun. The cash felt filthy, cursed. Every single bill was tainted with a profound human suffering. Page after page, the ledger laid the scheme bare with chilling precision. It was a systematic, brutal payroll skimming operation. Hundreds of undocumented migrant workers, hired to build the massive hydroelectric dam nearby, had been the victims. They were paid a fraction of what they were owed, their desperation and legal status used as weapons against them. The ledger was peppered with chilling notes: intimidation effective, group silenced, complaint withdrawn after visit. Liam felt a tremor of fear run through him, an empathetic echo of the terror those men must have felt. They were trapped, disposable, their lives and labor stolen by a predator who knew they had no recourse. This bus wasn't just a vehicle. It was a cage on wheels, transporting men to a site where their futures would be picked clean. Then he found the name. It was on one of the final pages, a summary of the operation's total profits. And at the bottom, signed with a confident, almost arrogant flick of the pen, was the mastermind, site manager and project lead, Alistair Finch. The name hit Liam with the force of a physical blow. Finch Salvage. A dizzying, terrifying connection snapped into place in his mind, and the entire world seemed to tilt on its axis. He felt his stomach drop, the nausea returning with a vengeance. The man who owned this graveyard of steel, the man whose property he was trespassing on, was the architect of this entire monstrous crime. He hadn't stumbled upon a random treasure. He had walked directly into the dragon's lair, and he was holding its hoard. The feeling of sheer, cosmic bad luck was so overwhelming it was almost laughable. He read the ledger's final frantic entry, his eyes flying across the page. The neat script had become a slightly messier, more urgent scrawl. The plan had been simple. This bus, which had served as the workers' transport, was to be their getaway vehicle. The final run. It was meant to smuggle the entire sum of skimmed cash, the $500,000 now sitting in a pile on the floor, out of the state, where it would disappear forever. The money was hidden in the seats, ready to go. But the last line of the ledger was abrupt, a short, sharp epitaph for the whole sordid affair. It read, "Engine seized, total loss, bus abandoned, package compromised." The plan had failed. The bus and the fortune hidden within it had been left here to rust, a 40-year-old secret sinking slowly into the mud. Liam felt a cold dread wash over him. The crime scene wasn't cold. It was here, and he was sitting right in the middle of it. The thought was cut short by a sudden, terrifying sound that ripped through the junkyard silence. The low rumble of a heavy engine. It grew louder, closer, a guttural growl that vibrated through the floor of the bus and up into Liam's bones. Then, a pair of brilliant white headlights sliced through the darkness, sweeping across the mountains of scrap and flashing through the bus's grimy windows, momentarily illuminating the scene in a stark, icy, brutal glare. Liam's blood turned to ice. His heart slammed against his ribs like a trapped bird. He moved on pure instinct, a surge of adrenaline washing away his paralysis. He scrambled on the floor, shoving the stacks of cash, the dirty, cursed money, into his old backpack, stuffing the ledger in last. He could hear the crunch of tires on gravel. They were here. Someone was here. He crawled to one of the windows he had patched with cardboard and peeled back a corner just enough to see a large, dark tow truck, its engine still rumbling like a sleeping beast, was parked less than 50 feet away. Its size was intimidating, a piece of industrial muscle. The words Finch Salvage were painted on the door in bold red letters. A man climbed out of the driver's side. He was big, much bigger than the scrawny man from the office. He wore a thick foreman's jacket and carried a heavy, high-powered flashlight. The beam cut a sharp, interrogating cone of light through the misty air, sweeping back and forth across the yard until it landed and stayed on the rusted shell of the school bus. Liam felt his breath catch in his throat. He ducked back from the window, his mind racing. They knew. Finch knew. A loud, aggressive banging on the metal door made Liam jump, the sound echoing through the bus like a series of gunshots. Bam! 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 The entire structure shuddered with the force of the blows. "Hello in there!" a man's voice called out. It was a deep, resonant baritone, but it held a false note of friendliness that made the hairs on the back of Liam's neck stand up. "Mr. Finch sent me. Just want a quick word. Mr. Finch." The name was a death knell. Liam's mind flashed to the ledger, to the stolen wages, to the 40 years of silence. This wasn't a social call. He glanced back at Maya, who was beginning to stir from the noise, and a fierce, primal wave of protectiveness washed over him. He was a cornered animal, and his child was in the burrow with him. With a trembling hand, Liam unlatched the door and opened it, but only a few inches, using his own body to block the entrance. The air that rushed in was cold and smelled of diesel fumes. The foreman stood there, a wide, predatory smile plastered on his face. His eyes, however, were not smiling. They were small and sharp, and they immediately darted past Liam, trying to pierce the darkness of the bus's interior. "Evening," the man said, his voice smooth as oil. "Sorry to drop by so late. The boss, Mr. Finch, he heard someone bought this old girl. He's got a sentimental attachment, you know. He's authorized me to offer you $1,500 for it, cash. Take it right off your hands, a tidy little profit for a day's trouble." The offer was a lure, a sweet-smelling bait laid on a steel trap. For one wild, desperate moment, Liam considered it. $1,500. It was a lifeline. Enough to get a motel room, to buy food, to get them out of this hellhole and figure out a new plan. He could just hand over the key, leave the backpack and its cursed contents behind, and walk away. He could forget he ever saw the ledger, forget the name Ramirez, forget Alistair Finch. It would be so easy. But then he saw the way the foreman's gaze lingered for a second too long on the back of the bus, right where Maya was sleeping. He felt the weight of the backpack on his shoulders, the silent testimony of the ledger pressing against his spine. This wasn't just about scrap metal. This was about what was inside. Taking the deal meant letting Finch win, letting him bury his secret forever. A strange, unfamiliar resolve hardened inside him. It was the stubborn pride of his carpenter father, the fierce integrity of his late wife. It was a voice he hadn't heard in a long time. He gripped the strap of his backpack, the rough canvas a grounding reality. He met the foreman's cold gaze. "No," he said, the word coming out stronger than he expected. A small, solid stone of defiance. "No, thank you. We're going to stay. I think I'll keep it." The lie felt both insane and absolutely necessary. He was drawing a line in the mud, defending a piece of rusted junk that had, in the span of a few hours, become the most important and dangerous place on earth. He felt his heart pounding a frantic rhythm, a drumbeat of fear and rebellion. The foreman's smile didn't just fade, it was wiped away, revealing a face as hard and unforgiving as granite. The sudden shift in his demeanor was terrifying. "That's a mistake," he said, his voice dropping to a low, flat tone that was far more threatening than any shout. His eyes flickered deliberately toward the rear of the bus, to the small, blanket-covered lump that was Maya, and then snapped back to Liam, pinning him with a cold, significant stare. He leaned forward, invading Liam's personal space, his breath a foul cloud in the frigid air. "This is no place to raise a kid," he hissed, the words dripping with menace. "A lot of heavy metal falls around here. Things get moved around in the dark. It would be a real shame if someone got hurt." The threat was no longer veiled. It was a sharpened blade held to his throat. The big man held his gaze for one more chilling second, a silent promise of violence, before turning abruptly and walking back to his truck. The crunch of his boots on the gravel sounded like bones breaking. The tow truck's engine roared, and its headlights swept across the bus one final blinding time before it pulled away, its red taillights disappearing into the dark labyrinth of the junkyard. Liam slammed the door shut, the shriek of rusted metal a pathetic echo of the scream building in his own chest. He was alone again. But the silence was different now. It was alive, pregnant with threat. The money wasn't a blessing. It was a death sentence. And Finch, the ghost from the ledger, was real, and he knew Liam had it. What would you do in his place? Would you grab the backpack and run into the night, hoping to escape a man with 40 years of practice in making people disappear? Or would you stand your ground on this forsaken patch of dirt and fight for the ghosts in the ledger, knowing it could cost you and your daughter everything? The foreman's truck was swallowed by the labyrinth of junk, but the echo of his threat remained, a toxic residue coating the inside of the bus. Liam slammed the door, the shriek of metal a pathetic protest against the sudden, crushing reality of his situation. He was no longer just destitute. He was a target. The man's final words, "A real shame if someone got hurt," played over and over in his mind, the casual menace more terrifying than any scream. His heart hammered a frantic, painful rhythm against his ribs. A cold sweat beaded on his forehead, his skin feeling clammy and tight. He looked at the backpack, now sitting on the floor like a black hole, drawing all light and hope into it. The $500,000 wasn't a ticket to a new life. It was a tombstone. He was trapped in a metal coffin with a fortune that belonged to a killer who knew he was here. Every gust of wind that whistled through the bus's wounds sounded like footsteps. Every creak of rusting metal was the sound of a door being forced open in the darkness. He stumbled to the back of the bus where Maya was stirring, her brow furrowed in her sleep. The foreman's cruel, calculated glance towards her had been a physical blow, a violation that ignited a white-hot rage deep within Liam's gut. He was a father, and that single, sacred duty now eclipsed every other fear. He knelt and gently touched her forehead, his rough, trembling hand a stark contrast to her soft, warm skin. He had to get her out of here. But where? Running blindly into the night, into the desolate, unfamiliar landscape, felt like another form of suicide. They had no car, no food, and only $17 left to their name. Finch owned this land, this whole forgotten corner of the world. His reach felt infinite, his power absolute. Liam felt like a mouse trapped in a maze with a patient, hungry snake. Every path led to the same inevitable end. The air grew thick and heavy, each breath a struggle. He felt the cold not in his bones anymore, but in his very soul, a deep, primal fear for his child's life. His mind, a frantic machine of calculations and terror, searched for an escape that didn't exist. He peered again through the cardboard patch on the window, his eyes scanning the bleak, moonlit panorama of decay. The junkyard was a silent, sprawling beast under the pale light, a kingdom of rust and ruin, ruled by a man who had been waiting 40 years to reclaim his bloody treasure. The thought of Finch, this wealthy, ruthless developer, searching for this specific bus for 4 decades, sent a new wave of terror through him. This wasn't a casual affair. It was an obsession. Finch wouldn't just scare him off, he would erase him. The foreman wasn't a warning. He was a promise. Liam's gaze swept past the mountains of scrap, past the skeletal remains of cars and trucks, and then it caught a single, tiny point of light. It was faint, a warm yellow flicker on a low hill overlooking the sprawling yard. A trailer, a human presence in this wasteland of metal. It was an impossible, irrational hope, but it was the only one he had. The decision was instant, a desperate lunge towards the only potential lifeline in a drowning sea. He had to reach that light. He had to believe someone was in that trailer who wasn't owned by Alistair Finch. He turned back to Maya, who was now awake, her eyes wide with fear in the gloom. "Daddy, who was that man?" she whispered, her voice trembling. A fresh stab of guilt twisted in Liam's heart. He forced his face into a mask of calm he was far from feeling. "Just a man who's lost, sweetie," he lied, the words tasting like poison. "We're going to go for a little walk now. Another adventure." He helped her into her thin jacket, his fingers fumbling with the zipper. He shouldered the impossibly heavy backpack, the weight of the cursed money a physical manifestation of his burden. He took her small, cold hand in his. "We have to be very, very quiet," he whispered, pressing a finger to his lips. "It's a game." A terrified nod broke his heart, but he had no choice. He had to turn this nightmare into a fairy tale for her. They didn't use the main door. It was too loud, too exposed. Liam remembered the emergency exit at the back. He worked the stiff and rusted latch, his muscles straining in the silence. It gave way with a low, metallic groan that sounded like a scream in the stillness of the night. He lifted Maya through the opening first, lowering her to the muddy ground, before slipping out himself. The cold air hit him like a slap, sharp and smelling of damp earth and oil. The moon was a cold, silver eye in the sky, casting the junkyard in a ghostly light. The piles of scrap metal became monstrous, lurking giants, their shadows long, distorted claws reaching out for them. Liam held Maya's hand, his own grip slick with sweat. He pointed towards the distant, flickering light of the trailer. "Aye, that star," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "We're going to walk to that star." He started moving, his every sense screaming, his body a tightly coiled spring of adrenaline and fear, ready to bolt at the slightest sound. The journey through the junkyard was a slow, agonizing trek through a landscape designed by nightmares. Liam led the way, one hand holding Maya's, the other held out in front of him, warding off the darkness. They navigated a treacherous maze, squeezing between the hollowed-out shells of cars that creaked and groaned in the wind. The ground was a minefield of sharp, rusty metal and shattered glass that crunched under his boots with a sound that felt deafeningly loud. He lifted Maya over the worst of the hazards, his muscles screaming from the strain and the weight of the backpack. The smell was overpowering, a symphony of decay, the sour stench of battery acid, the metallic tang of rust, the thick, cloying smell of old-eked, stagnant water. It was the smell of death, of things left to rot and be forgotten. With every step, Liam felt like they were sinking deeper into a forgotten tomb, and he prayed the light on the hill wasn't just another ghost. As they drew closer, the trailer came into sharper focus. It was an old Airstream, its aluminum skin dull and pockmarked, propped up on cinder blocks. A single, bare bulb cast a weak, yellow circle of light around its door. A rusted-out pickup truck, looking as ancient as the bus, was parked beside it. Just as they stepped into the edge of the light, a furious barking erupted from behind the trailer. A shape shot out of the darkness, a scruffy, medium-sized dog, its teeth bared. Liam froze, instinctively pulling Maya behind him, his heart leaping into his throat. A gruff voice cut through the barking. "Silencio! Diablo!" The trailer door creaked open, spilling more light into the yard. A man emerged, a silhouette against the dim interior. He was old and stooped, wearing overalls and holding a heavy wrench in one hand. His face was a road map of wrinkles, but his eyes, even in the gloom, were sharp and missed nothing. They took in Liam's disheveled state, the terror in his eyes, and the small child hiding behind his legs. "Can I help you?" the old man asked, his voice raspy, like gravel rolling downhill. He didn't sound friendly, but he didn't sound hostile either. He sounded tired, weary of the world. Liam, breathless and shivering from a combination of cold and fear, stumbled forward. The words came out in a rush, a desperate, jumbled torrent. "My name is Liam. I bought the old school bus down there." He gestured vaguely into the darkness. "A man just came from Finch. He threatened me. He threatened my daughter." He didn't say anything about the money. The weight of the secret was immense, a dangerous truth to share with a stranger. He just stood there, a desperate father pleading his case to the only other human being for miles, his entire future hanging on this old man's reaction. The mechanic's sharp eyes flickered from Liam's face, down to the backpack, and then to Maya, who peeked out from behind her father's legs. The dog, Diablo, had stopped barking and was now sniffing cautiously at Liam's boots, its tail giving a tentative wag. The old man stared at him for a long, silent moment, Liam could hear his own blood roaring in his ears, the silence stretched, taut and unbearable. Finally, the man grunted and gestured with the wrench toward the trailer's open door. "Get inside," he said, his voice still gruff. "Both of you. Before you freeze to death or Finch's foreman comes back to finish the job." The relief that washed over Liam was so powerful, it almost buckled his knees. He scooped a shivering Maya into his arms and hurried up the rickety wooden steps into the trailer, leaving the cold, menacing darkness of the junkyard behind. The inside of the trailer was cramped, cluttered, and surprisingly warm. It smelled of welding flux, strong black coffee, and old books. Tools and machine parts covered every surface, but it felt like a sanctuary, a fortress against the horrors outside. The old man followed them in, closing the door and bolting it with a heavy, reassuring thud. The sound was the safest thing Liam had heard all day. The mechanic introduced himself as Hector. He poured Liam a mug of thick black coffee that was so strong it felt like it could strip paint. He gave Maya a glass of water and a slightly stale cookie he produced from a tin. He moved with a slow, deliberate economy, his silence more comforting than any empty pleasantries. As Liam drank the scalding coffee, the warmth spreading through his chest and chasing away some of the deep-seated chill, Hector sat down at a small table. He didn't press for details. He just watched Liam with those unnervingly perceptive eyes. "That bus," Hector said finally, his voice a low rumble. "I remember when it was towed in here, 40 years ago, almost to the day." The statement hung in the air, heavy with unspoken history. Liam's hand tightened around his mug. He looked up, meeting Hector's gaze, and knew this man was more than just a random neighbor. He was a part of this story. He was a guardian of its secrets, a silent witness who had been waiting for 4 decades. The driver's name was Carlos, Hector continued, his eyes fixed on some distant point in the past. He was a good kid, young, maybe 25, worked hard, always sent money home to his family in Mexico. He drove that bus every day, taking the men to and from the dam project. Hector's voice was flat, recounting a story he had clearly told himself 1,000 times in the silence of his trailer. The last week, he was different. He was scared. I remember he came here, right to this trailer, for a cup of coffee. His hands were shaking so bad he spilled it all over the floor. A cold dread trickled down Liam's spine, colder than the junkyard air. He was listening to a ghost story, but the ghost was real. He could feel the weight of the ledger in the backpack, the name Alistair Finch like a brand on his thoughts. He knew what was coming next, but he had to hear it. The past was no longer a distant story. It was reaching out and wrapping its cold fingers around his throat. Hector leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, as if the ghosts of the past were listening. "Carlos told me his boss, Finch, was making him do one last run. Something that wasn't right. He said Finch was cleaning house, getting rid of loose ends before the project ended. He told me he was supposed to drive the bus out of state that weekend. He looked me right in the eye and said, 'Hector, I don't think I'm going to see you again. If I disappear, don't let him get away with it.'" Hector's eyes were glistening now, a sheen of 40-year-old grief and anger. He was terrified, not of getting caught, but of Finch himself. He knew his boss was a dangerous man, capable of anything. The air in the trailer crackled with the weight of the revelation. This wasn't just a hunch or a theory anymore. This was a first-hand account. The ledger didn't tell the whole story. It had left out the final, bloody chapter. Liam felt the floor drop out from under him as the puzzle pieces slammed into place. "The next day, Carlos was gone," Hector said, his voice now a low, mournful growl. "He never showed up for work. His things were still in his little rented room in town. He just vanished." He paused, taking a long, shaky breath. About a week later, they towed that bus in here. Finch himself oversaw it, said the engine had seized, that it was a worthless piece of junk. He told my boss to park it in the back corner and forget about it. He seemed anxious to have it gone, to have it swallowed up by the yard. Liam thought of the package compromised, the frantic final entry in the ledger. The engine hadn't just seized. Something had happened to stop that bus, to stop Carlos. Finch hadn't just lost the money. He had been forced to abandon it, leaving it inside a mobile crime scene. The bus wasn't just a hiding place. It was a monument to a failed getaway and very likely to a murder. And Liam had just bought the headstone. The realization was sickening. Liam finally broke his silence. His voice was a hoarse whisper. It's more than that, Hector. It's not just about Carlos disappearing. He slowly unzipped the backpack and pulled out the small, black ledger. He placed it on the table between them. Hector stared at it, his eyes widening as he recognized the form, the style of the old pocketbooks. Liam then unzipped the bag further, revealing the impossible stacks of $100 bills. Hector let out a low whistle, a sound of pure, unadulterated shock. He looked from the money to the ledger, then back to Liam's face, the pieces of a 40-year-old mystery finally assembling in his mind. Madre de Dios, he breathed. Liam opened the ledger and explained the payroll skimming scheme, the stolen wages, the names of the exploited men. He pointed to the final signature at the bottom of the summary page. Alistair Finch, he said, the name tasting like acid. Hector's face hardened, the wrinkles deepening into a mask of cold fury. The money was the motive, the ledger was the evidence. But there was one final, horrifying piece of the puzzle. Hector stood up, his movements stiff but purposeful. There's something else, he said, his voice grim. Something I've kept to myself for 40 years, something I was too afraid to talk about. He grabbed an old grease-stained jacket from a hook by the door. Put the girl on the couch. Cover her up. You need to see this. Liam hesitated for a second, then did as he was told, gently laying a deeply sleeping Maya on a worn sofa and covering her with a thick wool blanket. He followed Hector out into the cold night, the junkyard seeming even more menacing now that he understood the depth of its secrets. The dog, Diablo, trotted silently at Hector's heels, a furry shadow. They walked away from the trailer, not towards the main yard, but along a faint, overgrown path that led to the edge of Finch's vast property. The silence between them was thick with dread. Liam's heart pounded a slow, heavy rhythm, a funeral drum for a man named Carlos. Hector led him to a forgotten corner of the property, a desolate spot marked by a single, gnarled mesquite tree whose branches clawed at the night sky like skeletal fingers. The air here felt different, colder, heavier, with a palpable sorrow. The wind whispered through the dry leaves of the tree with a sound like a mournful sigh. A few months after Carlos and the bus disappeared, Hector said, his voice barely audible over the wind, I was walking the property line. I saw the ground here was wrong. It was disturbed. He stopped at the base of the tree and pointed a trembling finger at a shallow depression in the earth, barely visible in the moonlight. It was a fresh grave, not deep, dug in a hurry. Liam felt the blood drain from his face. He stared at the indentation in the ground, his mind recoiling from the implication. This wasn't just a theory anymore. This was a burial site. He was standing on the final resting place of the bus driver. I was young then and scared, Hector confessed, his voice thick with a lifetime of guilt. Finch owned the sheriff, the judges, everyone. To speak up was to end up like Carlos, but I had to know. He knelt, his old knees cracking in the cold, and began to push away the loose soil and dead leaves with his bare hands. I only dug a little, just enough. After a moment, his fingers brushed against something. He pulled it out. It was a rotted scrap of fabric, the sleeve of an old jacket, its once bright blue color now a faded, muddy gray. This was his, Hector whispered, holding out the pathetic scrap of cloth as if it were a holy relic. He loved this jacket, wore it all the time. I found this, and I filled the hole back in. I've been tending to this spot ever since, keeping it clear. It's the only headstone he ever got. The proof was undeniable, a tangible piece of a 40-year-old murder. Finch wasn't just a thief, he was a killer, and Liam was now the sole inheritor of that deadly secret. They walked back to the trailer in a heavy, oppressive silence, the weight of the shallow grave settling over them. The small, warm trailer no longer felt like a sanctuary, but like a besieged outpost, a tiny island of truth in an ocean of lies and violence. As they stepped back inside, the warmth feeling unnatural after the cold of the gravesite, Liam's cheap burner phone, which he'd bought with some of his last cash, buzzed violently on the table. It was a text message from an unknown number. Liam's blood ran cold as he read the stark, capitalized words glowing on the screen. 24 hours. Take the 1500 and go, or we clear the scrap. The ultimatum. The final warning. Finch was done playing games. He was closing the net. The threat was no longer a vague possibility. It was a ticking clock. counting down the last hours of Liam's life if he didn't comply. He showed the phone to Hector, whose face was already a grim mask of resolve. "He won't wait 24 hours, Hector said, his voice a low, certain growl. "That's not his style. He wants you scared. He wants you to spend the night sweating, thinking about it. He'll come tonight. He'll come when he thinks you're asleep, when your guard is down." Hector's certainty was terrifying because Liam knew instinctively that he was right. Finch had waited 40 years. He wouldn't wait another day. The foreman's visit was the reconnaissance. This text was the psychological warfare. The final assault would be swift and brutal. A wave of panic seized Liam, a desperate urge to grab Maya and the money and just run, to disappear into the vast, dark expanse of Texas. But Hector's next words stopped him cold. "Running is what he expects," the old man said, his eyes boring into Liam's. "It's what Carlos tried to do. We can't run. We have to fight. Right here. Tonight." The idea was insane. 2 men and a child against a wealthy, ruthless killer and his crew. But Hector had been planning this fight for 40 years. He walked to a dusty panel near the door and opened it, revealing a surprisingly modern piece of electronics wired into the trailer's wall. "Silent alarm," he explained, his voice filled with a grim satisfaction. "Had a friend, a lawyer in Austin, help me set it up years ago. When I press this button, it doesn't make a sound here, but it sends a signal directly to his office, and he has a standing order to route it, along with a package of sworn affidavits I wrote years ago, directly to a friend of his at the state police, her special investigator who hates corrupt local officials." Hector had built his own weapon, a silent arrow of justice aimed at Finch's heart, and he had kept it sharpened for decades, just waiting for the moment to fire it. "They'll come," Hector said, his voice firm with conviction, "but they need to catch him in the act. They need undeniable proof." The plan they devised was simple, desperate, and incredibly dangerous. Liam would be the bait. He would go back to the bus, making it look like he was hunkering down for the night, a scared man trying to wait out the storm. Maya would stay here, safe in the trailer with Hector. The backpack with the money and the ledger would go with Liam. It was the treasure Finch's men would be coming for. When they attacked the bus, Liam's job was not to fight, but to run. He would escape through the rear emergency door and flee back to the trailer. His arrival would be the signal. The moment he was safely inside, Hector would press the button, summoning a cavalry that Finch would never see coming. It was a wild gamble, a play that depended on perfect timing and Finch's predictable brutality. Liam's heart pounded at the thought. He would have to willingly walk back into the metal tomb and wait for the monsters to arrive. The hours that followed were the longest of Liam's life. He left Maya sleeping soundly on Hector's couch, the sight of her peaceful, innocent face, a stark contrast to the violence he was about to invite. He kissed her forehead, a silent promise that he would come back for her. Walking back to the bus with the heavy backpack was the hardest thing he had ever done. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like a whispered warning. He felt like a condemned man, walking to his own execution. The bus, when he reached it, was a dark, silent hulk, even more menacing than before. He slipped inside, the familiar shriek of the door sounding like a cry of despair. He sat in the darkness, the cold metal seeping into his bones, and waited. The silence was absolute, a heavy, suffocating blanket that amplified the frantic beating of his own heart. The air was thick with the smell of rust and his own fear. He didn't know how long he waited. It could have been an hour or a lifetime. Time had ceased to have meaning, replaced by a stretched, humming wire of pure tension. He clutched the straps of the backpack, the ledger and the cursed money a heavy weight against his spine. This was it, the culmination of 40 years of crime, greed, and silence, and he was sitting at its epicenter. Then he heard it, the sound that his entire nervous system was primed for, a soft crunch of boots on gravel. Slow and deliberate. It wasn't one person. The cadence was wrong. There were 2 of them. He crawled silently to the window, his breath held tight in his chest, and peered through a tiny rip in the cardboard. 2 large, dark figures were moving through the moonlight, their shapes bulky and menacing. One of them was carrying a sledgehammer, its heavy head gleaming dully. The other held a long, thick pry bar. They weren't here to talk. They were here to demolish. A low, Gravelly voice cut through the silence, just feet from the bus door. "Finch says get the packages and burn the rest. He wants it all gone by sunrise. The man, the bus, everything." Liam's blood turned to ice. Burn the rest. They weren't just going to take the money. They were going to erase him, incinerate the evidence, and leave nothing behind but ashes and a bad memory. This was Finch's final, brutal solution. Before he could even process the full horror of the command, the night exploded in a cataclysm of sound. A deafening boom of metal on metal rang out as the sledgehammer slammed into the side of the bus, just below the window. The entire structure shuddered violently, and Liam was thrown against the opposite wall. The sound was a physical assault, a declaration of war. Another crash followed, this time against the door, the metal groaning and buckling under the force of the blow. They were coming in. Adrenaline, pure and undiluted, surged through Liam's veins, washing away the fear and leaving only the cold, sharp instinct to survive. He scrambled to his feet, grabbing the backpack. The sounds of destruction were deafening now, the rhythmic, brutal slamming of the sledgehammer, the sharp, tearing shriek of the pry bar being wedged into the doorframe. He didn't have much time. He lunged for the rear of the bus, his feet slipping on the damp, grimy floor. He fumbled with the latch of the emergency door, his fingers clumsy with panic. The metal groaned in protest as he threw his shoulder against it. With a final, desperate shove, the door flew open, revealing the dark, chaotic maze of the junkyard. He didn't hesitate. He leaped out into the cold night air, landing hard on the muddy ground, the backpack a heavy, jarring weight on his back. Behind him, he heard the splintering crash of the main door finally giving way, followed by the triumphant shouts of the thugs. He ran. He ran with a desperation he had never known, his lungs burning, his legs pumping on pure, primal terror. He didn't look back. The sounds of the bus being torn apart pursued him, a horrifying symphony of destruction, the shattering of the remaining windows, the violent tearing of metal, the guttural oaths of the men as they ransacked the interior, searching for him, for the money. He ducked and weaved through the labyrinth of junked cars, the sharp edges of rusted fenders and broken bumpers tearing at his clothes. He could hear them now, shouting behind him. "He's gone. He's out the back. Find him." The hunt was on. He was no longer just bait. He was prey, fleeing through a metal jungle with wolves at his heels. The light of Hector's trailer was a distant, wavering beacon, a promise of safety that felt 1,000,000 miles away. He pushed harder, the sounds of his own ragged breathing and the frantic pounding of his heart, a drumbeat counting down his final seconds. He burst out of the last row of cars and into the open space leading up the hill to the trailer. He could see the light in the window, a warm, golden square in the terrifying darkness. He risked a glance behind him. 2 dark figures were emerging from the maze, their flashlights cutting frantic, angry swaths through the night. They had seen him. A shout echoed across the yard. "There he is! Get him!" Liam turned and scrambled up the muddy incline, his boots slipping, his lungs on fire. He could hear their heavy footsteps pounding the earth behind him, getting closer. The trailer door was just feet away. He threw himself forward, his body screaming with effort. Anne slammed his hand against the cold aluminum of the door. It flew open instantly. Hector was there, his face a grim, stony mask. He grabbed Liam by the jacket and yanked him inside, just as the first of the thugs reached the bottom of the hill. Hector slammed the heavy door shut and threw the bolt. The sound was a thunderclap of finality. He didn't say a word. He simply turned to the wall panel, his movements calm and deliberate, and pressed the small, unassuming black button. There was no sound, no bell, no siren. For a terrifying second, Liam thought nothing had happened. He stood there, panting, his body trembling, listening to the angry shouts and the thud of fists against the outside of the trailer door. The thugs were here, trying to beat their way in. Then Hector looked at him, and for the first time, a small, grim smile touched the old man's lips. "They're on their way," he said, his voice a low, satisfied rumble. The arrow sharpened for 40 years and had been released. Now all they could do was wait for it to strike its target and pray that the thin walls of the trailer would hold. The battle for the junkyard had begun. The trailer shuddered as a heavy boot slammed against the door, the metal groaning in protest. Liam's heart was a wild drum against his ribs, every thud from outside a fresh spike of terror. He held his breath, listening to the guttural curses of the men, their frustration boiling over into raw violence. The thin aluminum walls felt like paper, the only barrier between his small, fragile world and the raging storm outside. Hector stood like a statue carved from ancient stone, his face unreadable in the dim light, his hand still resting near the silent alarm button. For a moment, an awful, gut-wrenching silence descended, broken only by Liam's own ragged breathing and the soft sigh of Maya sleeping on the couch. Then, from the far distance, came a sound. It was faint at first, a high, thin wail, so quiet it could have been the wind, but then another joined it, and another, weaving together into an unmistakable chorus. Sirens, a cold, glorious wave of relief, so powerful it was almost painful, washed over Liam, and he finally, shakily, let out the breath he'd been holding. The distant wail of sirens grew rapidly into a deafening roar, a wave of sound that seemed to make the very air vibrate. Suddenly, the entire junkyard was painted in frantic, strobing flashes of red and blue light. The beams sliced through the darkness, turning the monstrous piles of scrap metal into a surreal, pulsating landscape. The angry shouting outside the trailer abruptly stopped, replaced by a moment of shocked silence, followed by the panicked sound of boots scrambling in the mud. Liam dared to peek through the trailer's small window. The scene was one of overwhelming force. State police cruisers were swarming into the yard from multiple directions, their tires churning up mud, their headlights pinning the area in a cage of brilliant white light. Doors flew open and uniformed officers emerged, weapons drawn, their movements a display of disciplined, unstoppable power. The junkyard, Finch's dark kingdom of secrets and decay, was no longer his. It was a crime scene, flooded with light and law. State police, on the ground, now! The commands, shouted through a bullhorn, were like cracks of thunder, echoing off the mountains of rust. The two thugs, caught in the open between the trailer and the wrecked bus, froze like animals in headlights, their bravado evaporating in an instant. One of them dropped his sledgehammer with a heavy thud. The other threw the pry bar away as if it were on fire. They were on their knees in the mud in seconds, hands behind their heads, the strobing lights reflecting on their terrified faces. A separate team of officers had already located the source of the operation. As Liam watched, they apprehended a figure standing by a dark SUV parked on a rise overlooking the scene. Even from a distance, Liam could see the stunned disbelief on the man's face, illuminated in the harsh glare of a flashlight. Alistair Finch, the untouchable ghost from the ledger, looked old and small as the cold, metallic click of handcuffs closing around his wrists echoed faintly across the yard. The 40-year reign of terror was over. The hours that followed were a blur of official procedure, but a blur filled with a strange sense of peace. Hector, no longer a reclusive mechanic but a star witness, calmly and deliberately recounted his 40-year-old story to a grim-faced state investigator. His testimony, delivered in the warm, coffee-scented sanctuary of his trailer, was the human voice that gave life to the cold facts. He spoke of his friend Carlos, of his fear, and of the shallow grave he had guarded for 4 decades. Liam, his hand still trembling slightly, presented the backpack. He laid the stacks of cash on Hector's table, a shocking pile of evidence, but the true bombshell was the small, black ledger. As the investigator carefully turned its brittle pages under the light, his expression hardened. He looked from the neat columns of skimmed wages to the list of intimidated workers, then to the final, damning signature of Alistair Finch. The story, hidden for so long in the decaying guts of a forgotten bus, was finally being read by someone with the power to act. The final nails in Finch's coffin were hammered in by science and his own arrogance. A forensics team, guided by Hector, excavated the shallow grave beneath the gnarled mesquite tree. Their work was quiet and respectful, and what they found confirmed everything. The remains of Carlos Ramirez, along with the telltale fracture on his skull, told the silent, brutal story of his final moments. Finch's men, caught red-handed, quickly turned on their employer, their confessions detailing Finch's explicit orders to retrieve the money and burn the rest, including anyone who got in the way. For Alistair Finch, there was no escape. The combination of Hector's long-held testimony, the irrefutable evidence of the ledger, the discovery of his victim's body, and the apprehension of his thugs in the commission of a violent felony created a perfect, inescapable case. The ghosts of the Hydro Dam project, silenced for so long, were finally screaming for justice, and the world was forced to listen. The trial was a formality. Faced with a mountain of evidence and the testimony of his own hired muscle, Alistair Finch was convicted of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and decades of racketeering. The man who had built an empire on the stolen hopes of the powerless was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He would end his days in a concrete box, a fate far kinder than the one he had given Carlos Ramirez. Liam watched the verdict from the back of the courtroom, a silent observer to the final chapter of a story he had stumbled into. He felt no joy, only a profound sense of closure. The weight of the secret was finally lifted, not just from his shoulders, but from the very soul of the land itself. Justice, delayed for 40 years, had at last been served, and the silent, patient vigil of the old mechanic in the hills had been vindicated. The junkyard, once a symbol of decay and death, was now a place of reckoning. The question of the money remained. The $500,000 sat in an evidence locker, a fortune built on suffering. A judge, in a quiet hearing a few months later, made the final life-altering ruling. The court had made extensive efforts to locate the original victims of the payroll skimming scheme, or their descendants, but after 40 years and the transient nature of their lives, it was an impossible task. The money was officially declared unclaimed. Citing the direct danger Liam and his daughter had been placed in by discovering the crime and their essential role in bringing a murderer to justice, the judge made an extraordinary decision. Under a finder's reward provision, the entire sum, every last stolen dollar, was awarded to Liam. The gavel fell with a simple, solid crack. In that moment, the cursed treasure of Alistair Finch was transformed into a tool of redemption. It was no longer the price of a man's life. It was the start of a new one. 6 months later, the acrid smell of rust and mildew was a distant, fading memory. It had been replaced by the rich, clean scent of freshly cut pine and sawdust. Liam stood in his own workshop, a converted garage behind a modest but sturdy house on a quiet, tree-lined street. Sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating the fine dust that danced in the air. His hands, once idle and despairing, were now busy, confidently guiding a piece of wood through a table saw. He was building a custom bookshelf, his first commission for his new small business, heirloom carpentry. He was no longer a man sinking, but a man building. The crushing weight of failure had been lifted, replaced by the simple, profound satisfaction of creating something beautiful and lasting with his own 2 hands. He had not just found a fortune, he had found his purpose again, a purpose he thought he had lost forever in the cold darkness of that apartment. That evening, the warm glow from the dining room window spilled out onto the neat green lawn. Inside, the table was not set with a single, watery can of soup, but with a roast chicken, potatoes, and fresh vegetables. The sound filling the small house was not the oppressive silence of poverty, but the bright, unrestrained laughter of a happy child. Maya, her own room filled with new books and art supplies, was excitedly telling him about her day at her new school. Liam watched her, his heart filled with a warmth that had nothing to do with the oven. He saw the trust in her eyes, the same trust as before, but this time, he knew with every fiber of his being that he deserved it. He was a protector who could protect, a provider who could provide. The ghosts of the past had been laid to rest, and in their place, a future, solid and real, was being built. One meal, one laugh, and one piece of furniture at a time. Liam's journey from the absolute bottom, a rusted-out bus in a forgotten junkyard, to a life of peace and purpose, is a testament to the fact that sometimes the darkest places hide the most unexpected light. He didn't just find money, he found courage, an unlikely friend, and the strength to fight for those who couldn't. He closed a circle of violence and injustice that had remained open for decades, and in doing so, he built a new, unbroken circle for himself and his daughter, one of safety, stability, and love. The scars of what they endured would always remain, a reminder of how close they came to the edge, but they were now just scars, not open wounds. What would you have done with the ledger? The stories we tell here are about ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances, facing impossible choices, If you want to hear more incredible stories of survival, mystery, and redemption, make sure you subscribe to our channel and click the notification bell. You won't want to miss what we uncover next.